Welcome to our latest Arizona's Family Investigates podcast. This is where we take deep dives into some stories and issues that our team investigates here at CBS 5, 3TV, and azfamily.com. I'm Morgan Loew. I'm an investigative reporter with AZ Family, and I'm joined here by Nicole Kreitz, one of our news anchors, and Cody Lillick, our senior investigative producer. Today, we're going to talk about the Department of Justice investigation into the Phoenix Police Department. We've spent the past couple of weeks looking at the pages of this 100-plus page report, comparing its findings with some of the data we've been able to track down, comparing the report's descriptions and characterization of one event that occurred in Phoenix with our own video record of that event. And we spoke to a couple of legal experts to get their reaction to what we found. And we did find some inconsistencies and problems with parts of this report. We're going to get into that in just a moment. But first, let's review what led to this. In August of 2021, the Department of Justice opened a pattern or practice investigation into the Phoenix Police Department. After nearly 3 years, here is what the DOJ investigators concluded. Phoenix PD uses excessive force, including unjustified deadly force and other types of force. Phoenix PD and the city unlawfully detain, cite, and arrest people experiencing homelessness and unlawfully dispose of their belongings. Phoenix PD discriminates against Black, Hispanic, Native American people when enforcing the law. Phoenix PD violates the rights of people engaged in protected speech and expression. Phoenix PD and the city discriminate against people with behavioral health disabilities when dispatching calls for assistance and responding to people in crisis. Now, here is a clip from Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Kristen Clark, when she announced the findings.
Our findings today reveal very significant and severe violations of federal law and the Constitution. This is one instance where we can't count on the police to police themselves.
That was harsh, to say the least. I want to bring in our panel now and discuss what the findings were and reaction to this. So, Nicole, let's start with you. Reaction.
Right out the gate, it's declarative statements as facts that people are taking and thinking, gosh, this is historic, this is horrible, this is terrible, without much context for the fact that some of these case studies that are cited in this report have already been adjudicated and cleared by the courts. At least one example we know of, the Harris case, where the Ninth Circuit Court reviewed and found that those officers' actions were constitutional. So there seems to be lacking context for things that had kind of pinged on the radar for the feds without any kind of action like, okay, well, before the feds released this report, Phoenix police already did a number of things to try to handle this on the front end. They didn't want to deal with the same situation like MCSO has been more than a decade under federal oversight with a monitor that's basically running their department, costing more than $250 million. So they front-loaded it by bringing in an interim chief, Michael Sullivan, who's dealt with Department of Justice investigations before, and in good faith, they're like, what can we do? Help us, walk us through this. And so they kind of overhauled their use of force policy. They brought in public input. They got people under multiple rounds of reviews, released those findings and said, okay, this is what we think our use of force policy should look like now, and got some remarks and, talked to public advocates, all those things, and incorporated all of those concerns. So preemptively, they did all these things. They did a number of things. Another one, a huge one, is they also they have had a mental health consultant working with 911 dispatchers for a long time. That's not reflected in this report either. So there's a lot of allegations of like, these are problems, without any acknowledgement that Phoenix preemptively, voluntarily already started implementing changes before this report was released.
Yeah, I think there were a couple of times in that speech, in that presentation by Kristen Clark, where she acknowledged that there were efforts, but really seem to downplay the breadth of the efforts that have happened here. Cody, what did you see?
Well, and that was one of the frustrations that the city had in this whole process. Is it started years ago and went up, and we're now in 2024, and it was talking about incidents in 2016, 17, and really the scope was kind of, the ending wasn't really defined. So the city was really frustrated and started making their own reforms and published their own Road to Reform report to address some of the things that they speculated might be in this report. And that's what makes this report unique. You look at other cities across the country where this has happened as a comparison, but it's hard because this is not a Breonna Taylor. This is not, there was no one incident here that sparked this investigation. It was several incidents here in Phoenix and several topics that the DOJ chose to look into. And I think a large frustration with the city is that they really had no end date of, you know, what is it you're looking at here and when does it end? So that's when the city started to do their own report and address things that they had started doing already on their own. Our Amy Cutler on our investigative team has highlighted some of those, their de-escalation training and also the mental health response. She's reported on those and the changes that have gone through the department, and they were not waiting on the report from the DOJ and just taking these actions on their own. Because, as Nicole mentioned, there are some large consequences here, and we don't have to look far to see what some of those consequences have been at the sheriff's office.
And as far as consequences, I mean, every public agency is open to criticism. There's not a public agency out there that says they do things perfectly. If there are, then you know that they're not accurate. But these are real consequences. This isn't just criticism. What the DOJ would like to do here, and what they have done in other situations, is come in with a consent decree that basically puts a monitor in and oversees the department to make sure that they're abiding by these new ways of doing business that respects people's constitutional rights. But there are problems. I mean, that method isn't perfect. Nicole, what have you heard about the criticisms of the consent decree and monitor model?
What a mess. We can use our own, what's still unfolding with MCSO right now. So in the Sheriff Joe Arpaio era, he was found to have racially profiled against Latinos. He ran those infamous crime sweeps and criminal roundups targeting illegal immigrants. So he would do it for employers. He would come through neighborhoods and just do these sweeps. And so the DOJ said, hey, this is clearly racially profiling. And, you know, then he got held in contempt, all these. It was a hot mess. I don't think anyone would argue with that. So the DOJ comes in, brings in this federal monitor, but it is like a 300 plus list of itemized specific things, check marks that the DOJ federal monitor has to check off every time that they're going through. And if there's one discrepancy or two, you start the clock back over again. They have to have a clean slate for 3 full years, full compliance. And I spoke with Paul Penzone when he was on his way out. He's like, this is unreasonable. He even met one-on-one with the monitor when he first came into office and said, can we work with you? We have the same goal in mind. This is a new phase. We're charting forward. We want to make progress. We want to turn things around. I think we were already making changes. And he said he just felt like out the gate, they were like, well, maybe you'll be a second term, maybe you'll be a third term sheriff, but it's going to be a while. We can't commit to, setting a reasonable expectation of when our exit strategy would be. So I think that's the biggest concern for the biggest critique against federal oversight is there is no end in sight. And we've looked at other departments nationwide. Morgan, you and Cody unearthed that DOJ memo from Merrick Garland.
Yeah, no exit strategy. And the price, I mean, $240 million in counting.
Crazy.
With the county. Cody, tell us about that memo.
The memo itself, basically, Merrick Garland says, we need to re-examine how these monitors and how we are doing this, because you look at the MCSO case, this particular monitor, he is not only tasked with the monitorship of MCSO, but also another agency. I believe it's Oakland, California.
Right.
And there's some controversy there as well that we've reported on, that he was accused to have basically told the mayor there to make a personnel decision. So
Get rid of the chief.
Right.
Repeatedly.
And so, I mean, and they don't answer to the public.
Mm-hmm.
So we've tried to track down this monitor. He's based in North Carolina, working largely supervisor role remotely that we can tell. Does have an office here in the county that the county pays for. The county, in their latest budget presentation, that their costs for the monitor, basically from when this case started to now, next year it will go over $300 million.
Wow. And that memo from Merrick Garland's office basically acknowledges that there's no exit strategy for these, so they take too long and that they are too expensive.
Well, you were talking about how there's no end in sight. I've attended the MCSO hearings in court, and there is no ending in sight. They still have not reached full compliance. So that time that they have after reaching full compliance hasn't even started yet.
Yeah, and that's something that I've heard from law enforcement officials, is it seems like the goal is not to get a really good department, law enforcement department. It's to get a perfect law enforcement department. And this MCSO is a big agency. The Phoenix Police Department are big agencies. And I think that if anybody says that they can get in there and get perfection, they don't know what it's really like to run one of those big agencies. So when we started looking into this issue pretty closely last fall, we spoke to a man named Bob Scales. Now, he is a critic of the Justice Department when it comes to these civil rights investigations. Let's just throw that out there. But he has some experience with this type of thing. He worked with the Seattle City Attorney's Office when that city was the target of a DOJ civil rights investigation. He represented the city during that investigation. Here's some of what he told us.
So all the DOJ findings letter are the personal opinions of some unnamed attorneys and experts who have no firsthand knowledge of what happened. They don't have to provide any evidence because they're not in court. They're just releasing some letter to the public about what they think about Phoenix PD.
Okay, that's Bob Scales, and he has a lot of deep-rooted criticisms of the Department of Justice. But let's talk about some of what he said there. He and others have made a big point that an attorney did not sign this report. There's no signature at the end. Cody, is that significant?
Yes and no. I mean, from the critics' perspective, yes. But we know that there were makeup of several different attorneys and investigators at DOJ who were responsible for each section of that. And the way that we know that is there was a community meeting held the night of the report's release from the DOJ. It was held via Zoom. Not sure exactly why it was held via Zoom and not in the community itself. But according to them, they had 200 people on this Zoom call. It was Brady Bunch style of attorneys explaining each of their sections. But without that, we would not have basically known the people responsible for each section. We heard earlier in the day from the Assistant Attorney General, while she is the highest ranking member, she likely didn't have a lot of hands-on in this report. These people, the Brady Bunch characters that we saw in the Zoom lined up there, those were the people who were here and saw what they wrote in the report and who crafted this more than 100 pages.
And none of them signed it. And the problem with that on a document is it can raise suspicions. If you don't sign your name to it, can you stand behind it? And there's also the issue is, who do you blame if you find something wrong? And we're going to talk about that in a second. But first, Nicole, he brings up this idea that you brought up earlier, which is they have these anecdotes, but not a lot of proof in there to back those anecdotes up. broad statements.
They've been investigating for 3 years, and at the end of the day, this is what you've got. I think critical thinkers would expect names, dates, case numbers, facts, body camera of specific acts. And they went over, they talked about, 180,000 documents, 22,000 body-worn cameras, 200 911 calls, 130 interviews, 200 hours of ride-alongs. So they blitz you with that, and it's like the wow factor. Look at how hard we worked to get to the bottom of this. But very few specific case studies to say, case in point, this is a breaking your constitutional right. Here's victim A, and then here's victim B. This is a 3-year-long study. And just for context, Phoenix PD reportedly gets 1.7 million calls for service a year. So if you're talking 2016 to 22, roughly, that's 10 million calls. So yes, while it sounds impressive that they, went through 200 911 calls, we're talking 1.7 million a year. What's the context for this? I want specifics. I think critical thinkers are like, show me the money. You've been at this 3 years. What's your actual meat to your argument here?
Where is it? So let's take a look at some of what was written in here. And I want to start with just the introduction. If somebody is unaware of what's going on in Phoenix, the history, the people who wrote this report gave an introduction to Phoenix. And this is what it says. Right off the bat, state officials project an insufficient water supply for Phoenix residents over the next century, given the city's growing population and drought-like conditions. Nothing to do with policing here, but also that is inaccurate. That might apply to some of the suburbs, but the city of Phoenix does have a guaranteed 100-year water supply.
Well, that's like whenever you see the national news try to cover Phoenix water issues, they choose, the outlying areas and not the picture that is Phoenix.
They call it Phoenix, but it's the outlying areas. But this is the Justice Department. They're supposed to get it right.
Yeah.
Then there's a statement here. Phoenix also bears the geographic and economic scars of segregation. And it goes into past segregating practices in real estate. But then it makes the statement, Phoenix remains segregated. And then they say, Phoenix's segregation is compounded by economic inequality. Nearly 15% of Phoenix residents live below the poverty line. That sounds terrible, right? It sounds terrible when you don't put it into context. Mm-hmm. So I looked at that poverty line, and what does 15% of the population living below the poverty line mean? So I looked up the percentage of people in the most populous cities across the country. Phoenix is in the lower half of the 30 most populous cities. When it comes to the poverty line at 15%, we're below Philadelphia, Houston, Boston, New York City, Columbus, Los Angeles, Chicago, Dallas, Washington, D.C. All of these other big cities have a worse poverty level. And I'm not saying that 15% poverty line is something to brag about, but it's the way it was characterized here. Mm-hmm. Because of this segregation, we have this terrible poverty situation. And Cody, you and I talked about, segregation. Is Phoenix really a segregated city?
Possibly, but not more than any other major city in America. The issues that they raise, the issues with real estate disparities dating back decades, that is not a new problem. That is not just a Phoenix problem. That is an American problem. It's an American major city problem because, we have not, we grow where we've grown up. And so much so that you can even look at transportation disparities, that, you can look at major cities and ask, interstates that have been built in a certain area. I came from New Orleans. There was discussion there about where certain roadways were established and the segregation that naturally developed there because of that roadway placement. So it's not just a Phoenix problem. It's a American major city problem. But this report just looked with blinders at Phoenix, which is what it's supposed to do. But it can be elsewhere as well.
But by making those statements in the scope of this investigation, it therefore suggests that the police force actions contribute to the segregation.
It seems like there was some subliminal messaging.
Suggestive.
Yeah, suggestive messaging going out here. And that struck me right off the top, so I wanted to include this. So let's talk about one of the first events here, this July 2017 protest. Now, under the heading, Phoenix PD retaliates against protesters by using indiscriminate force, the report states, the indiscriminate use of chemical gas, pepper spray, or projectiles against protesters can cause serious injuries and deter political speech. They then described this protest back in 2017 that took place after a Trump rally in downtown Phoenix. And in Kristen Clark's message in her presentation, she referred to them as peaceful protesters that were there. And so they make this statement about retaliating against protesters. They use this example, this protest. I was there. We televised this. We have a lot of video. Now, I'm sure there were peaceful protesters there, but we also saw a decent amount of protesters who were not peaceful, who were throwing things at the police. In court documents, it says they were throwing rocks, water bottles, and tear gas cans. We saw the tear gas cans and water bottles. I didn't see any rocks, but it was listed in a court case, so I understand that. The question is, how could they characterize this as a peaceful demonstration when the video and the people who were there clearly would have a different point of view? And does that create a problem, you think?
I think it goes back to what we said out the gate. When you're dealing with a federal report from the Justice Department, you have an anticipation that it's going to be a factual document. It's going to be based in fact, not opinion, and there will be supportive elements, right? So by her categorizing that as a peaceful protest, I think that's inaccurate. And if she is going to declare it as a peaceful protest, she should have attributed to a certain source who would be named. So-and-so said this was a peaceful protest. And then that is like, okay, that's that person's opinion. But for her to list it as a statement of fact, I was there that night. I was in studio. You were in the field. And yeah, we saw repeated warnings from law enforcement who did show up. Yes, they were wearing, and a lot of people say, oh, by them, lining up in riot gear, that is, kind of, what's the word I'm looking for?
It's not de-escalating.
Yeah, they're saying, that's kind of like, pushing them in a different way or, setting them up for, different acts. But the bottom line, they were repeatedly given warnings, verbal commands, like you need to disperse from this area or whatever, And when things went sideways, you had a crowd that was pretty wild and chaotic. So peaceful, that's an opinion. And I think you can find quite a few people who would disagree with that opinion.
Well, it goes back to painting these events, not just the protests, but all of these events in the city of Phoenix with a broad brush. You expect the Department of Justice, seasoned attorneys and prosecutors to release a report that has, appendices and, examples and, where did
Footnotes.
They get this?
Yep.
Footnotes, there were very few. Matter of fact, we had to have most of the newsroom piecing together. It's like, oh, this quote I think is from this incident or that incident. There wasn't a lot of detail in it. And I know we've talked to our colleagues at Wave News in Louisville who have a similar DOJ decision or report that was released. And they went through it like we did and found that there were some misstatements, not exactly how it unfolded in the incidents in their report. So, they actually encouraged us, examine what they found and, question it. Because to kind of peel back the layer of, why we put so much importance of this report, Phoenix PD, they release certain incidents on video, and certain critical incident briefings are selectively edited when you have an officer-involved shooting. But we don't get a lot of detail in the overall scheme of things. We can submit records requests, but we have to wait a good bit for records to get released from the Phoenix Police Department.
Sometimes the police can do a little better job, I would say, of helping themselves in a situation by releasing more and being a little more transparent. That's the view of a reporter, obviously.
For devil's context, devil's advocacy context here, I think for departments in the Valley and the state, Phoenix has led the way because they were the first in Arizona, I believe, to put out critical incident videos. And again, they're editing it and putting it together. But other departments don't even do that. We don't get body-worn camera. We don't get that type of stuff until, weeks, if not months. So they have been
Just to tie this protest part of this in a little bit of a bow, I'm reading from the section here that talked about that protest in 2017. Said there were approximately 6,000 protesters were demonstrating peacefully when a group of no more than 20 people began to shake a temporary police barricade. So they're saying it was 20 people. I don't know what the number was, but there were certainly people that were all around doing this. And then it also says, within minutes, this tear gas engulfed a, quote, vast area of downtown. Downtown Phoenix is a fairly large area. I was there. This was about a 2-block, maybe a 2-square block area, which is, I don't know about a vast area of downtown. And then it says, scores of peaceful demonstrators were forced to end their protest and leave the area. These statements, over and over, that, like you said, statements of fact, that I'm not sure these are, statements of fact. I'm sure that there were peaceful demonstrators. There were a lot of demonstrators in the street that were blocking traffic or blocking cars. Are they peaceful? They're violating the law. I don't know that you can call them peaceful, but it just brings up some questions when they describe it like that. And I want to move on now to a section of this that we took a pretty hard look at, and that was the way that the police treat the homeless population. And I will say, someone who's listening to this, they may be asking us, well, how come you aren't looking at the police shootings this carefully, or you're not looking at the way police are pulling people over this carefully? We're looking at what we have access to independently corroborate. And so we were at that protest. We saw it. We saw some factual inaccuracies. So when it comes to this section of the way the police deal with the homeless population, we have some information that sheds light and raises some questions here. So this is under the section that officers frequently lack a lawful basis to detain homeless people. And it's, in essence, talking about how Phoenix police harass the homeless population. It mentions early on that in Phoenix, it is not a crime to sleep on a sidewalk. It isn't. There's no current ordinance that says you can't sleep on the sidewalk. It's not a crime to sleep in a city park. However, it is a crime to trespass. It is a crime to be in a city park after the park has closed. It would be a crime. You can't have soccer practice in a city park after it's closed. You can't sleep in a city park after it's closed. So what we have here in this section is the DOJ person who wrote this talks about Phoenix PD harassing homeless people by waking them up. And they make the statement, it's not a crime to sleep on the sidewalk. And then they give an example here. For example, one 69-year-old man has accumulated multiple citations and arrests for sitting and sleeping on public property. Now, they mention public property. In 2017, officers arrested him for loitering in a closed park. He had been sleeping under a blanket using his backpack as a pillow. In 2021, officers again found the man wrapped in a blanket sleeping upright in a canal. The problem here, you can't be on canal property. That's trespassing. You can't sleep in a city park. It's trespassing. And my problem with this is they point out a real problem. Like, you can't arrest people for sleeping on a sidewalk unless you're blocking the sidewalk. But the example that they gave doesn't back up their point, because these were lawful arrests. this guy was trespassing in a closed city park. He was trespassing in a canal. And it makes me wonder, is this the best example they had? And if it isn't, why did they put that in there? And that's one of those questions that came out in this. Nicole?
It is, again, we're asking to be shown case studies. This is a federal investigation. It's a big deal. So when it comes out to this report, we want to dive into there. We want to highlight things, and we want to look at actual cases. And this is apples to oranges, just like you pointed out there. It's not supportive of the claim that they're making. There's also been reports about like the waking homeless people up. And I know that law enforcement in their interviews with the DOJ had said, we just came off a record year of heat. So many times in the summer, one part of contacting people who are unmoving is to wake them up to see, do we have someone who's in heat distress? Do we have somebody who's dealing with that? So there are other circumstances for things, but streets, parks, canals, these are not the same thing.
Right. They are differences with their significant differences.
Yeah.
And there's another
and it
section.
matters
Yeah.
in legal terminology.
Yeah. So there's another part in here where we have heard questions from police sources that there are accusations that police officers, commanders who were interviewed for this were not quoted properly, correctly. And so there's one incident that has something to do with what we're talking about here with the policing the homeless. This is from the DOJ findings report, page 49. And it says, and it's talking about that practice of waking up homeless people. And the DOJ is looking at this from the perspective that that's harassment. So it says here, quote, but when we asked the Phoenix police commander in charge of the shelter and street squads whether Phoenix PD had reconsidered the practice of waking people up, he told us, we're still going to wake people to arrest them. So a very succinct quote there. Now we have the transcript of what was actually said according to the police department, according to these police sources. And this is what he actually said. And if an individual is trespassing, there are times, we're going to wake people up if they're trespassing, if they're sleeping on private property, we're still going to address that as a crime. And we are still going to, make contacts with individuals that are committing crimes. That's a different quote. That's it's not just, we're still going to wake them up and arrest them. Like that adds real context there. And when you see an example like that, it does make you wonder. We don't have access to the source material here. The city of Phoenix doesn't have access to the source material here. So we can't check these quotes. We can't check these stats. There's another situation. There's another incident here with the in the section on the homeless. Early on in the report, it says that homeless people accounted for a full 37% of Phoenix PD arrests. But then deeper in the report, it says homeless people accounted for 37% of misdemeanor arrests and citations. So you might think that is a difference that is not significant, but that's different. It's 37% of arrests as the headline early on, and now, it's 37% of misdemeanor and citations. That is different. And this is the Department of Justice that put this together. And they shouldn't be making mistakes like that. Whether they're a mistake or a misstatement, it probably shouldn't be in there.
It would skew heavily to citations as well. And that actually might be a counterpoint to their initial argument. If it's more citations than misdemeanor arrests or anything further than that. So it absolutely matters.
And we don't have access to this.
I was about to say, and if you found one thing, that just leads to the question of what else don't we know? What else might be misquoted? We don't know.
Right. So we spoke to an attorney named Steve Serbalik, he's an attorney who represents police officers across the state of Arizona, and he's an attorney for the Arizona Conference of Police and Sheriffs. And I asked him if these details that we pointed out here, that some people may view as very small in the grand scheme of this report, if these details matter. Here's what he said.
The public is going to want to evaluate and participate in holding the police department accountable, which is something that we value. They need to have the facts correct. And those examples that you gave and dozens more in the report show that the report has conclusions that aren't supported by facts.
So that's from an attorney. And yes, he is a DOJ critic because he represents police officers, but he does have a point here in that you have to be able to rely on this stuff. This report is not a court document, but you expect it to be correct. So there are a couple of other things, Nicole, that you've seen when you've looked at here, starting with the criticism by the DOJ that the city of Phoenix doesn't de-escalate when it could.
Yeah. So, when you hear pattern and practice, failure to de-escalate and use of force, excessive force, deadly force, let's put that in context. It was before the BLM protests many years ago, under the tenure of the previous chief, Jerry Williams, that the DOJ actually came to Phoenix to get a look at Phoenix's de-escalation training and tactics. I went through that as like a journalist, and they put you in, they give you just very little information, and I'll just run you through one of the scenarios. They said, okay, you're showing up at a scene, a woman has a restraining order against her ex, and he's violating the restraining order, turn around and go. I see a guy lifting a machine gun out of a trunk, and he's like, I'm gonna kill that bee, and starts marching towards the house. I'm like, sir, put the gun down, sir. I shot him in the back with my simulated gun. And they go, okay, so the headline check, it's going to be tomorrow, cop shoots man in the back. And it was interesting because they talk about how much they did that right out the gate to show there's circumstances that, we have to look at every shooting, every incidence is a case-by-case study.
Right.
You can't oversimplify things just to look at that. But they made this little city, and each of the case scenarios are based on previous cases where they could have done things differently. So this was before this whole craziness with the DOJ investigation came through. Jerry Williams came in and said, let's really look at de-escalation tactics, and started training her teams that way. But if you do look at recent shootings, I went back, and I know that we put these online on our AZ Family website, and we do shootings for the entire valley. So Phoenix Police year-to-date has had 10 officer-involved shootings, as they categorize them. 8 of the 10 shootings, the suspect shot at officers first. The other 2, law enforcement used less than lethal first before shooting. And then the other one was an armed robbery suspect who pointed a gun at officers. So 8 of 10 times, their officers were shot at. So it is a very chicken and egg thing that a lot of advocates are like, the whole precursor to this was Phoenix had an inordinate number of police shootings, and that kind of pinged everyone on the radar. Then the protests happened, and then the homeless thing. But I think the shootings, the volume of shootings, officer-involved shootings in the city of Phoenix really kind of put it on a national radar. But if you look at chicken and egg, we're dealing with drug use that's through the roof, people who are, you're seeing criminals who are being more brazen with law enforcement and innocent citizens. So we're seeing that.
You've got to look at the specific situations, and as you said, 8 out of 10 this year, the person shot at the police officer first. The other thing that struck me out of this, the tone and the way it was written, and listening to some of these DOJ attorneys talk in that community meeting, they use language, Phoenix police do this.
Right.
The Phoenix Police Department does that. It's current, it's active, and these are blanket statements. It's not, there are maybe a large number of cases where the police have done this. It seems like it was very combative right off the bat, and just blanketed the department with these labels. So we've been talking now for quite a while. We're gonna start to wrap it up, but Cody, I wanted to look at you and ask, what happens from here?
There's a few options. They can either agree to go along with the DOJ. It's called an agreement in principle, basically, where the city would agree with the DOJ and go forward with what the DOJ would like, which is more than likely a consent decree and federal monitor. They could go with what's called a consent decree light, which is a negotiated type of settlement, basically. Or we could go with what is largely what we believe is taking shape, and that is that the city may be preparing to fight this. And that is an avenue that has not been taken. When you look at overall these DOJ investigations and pattern or practice, and it could be a very costly battle for the city of Phoenix, and comes at a very critical time for the police department, which is already dealing with the staffing issue. And now you have the issue of trying to hire staff for an understaffed agency that is under DOJ scrutiny.
Yeah, and if you're an attorney for the city of Phoenix and you look at a report like this and you see mistakes, it may make you counsel your client to say, let's see if we can take them on. But we'll find out what the city does. Nicole?
I think it's maddening that we haven't had any follow-up from Merrick Garland after that initial memo saying, we need to find an end in sight. We need to find an exit strategy. It's like going to a chiropractor who says, you got this problem, but keep coming back to me and I can get it a little bit better next month. I'll just give you another adjustment. I don't think you're ready to stop seeing me. That's kind of what we're looking at here. I think the other huge thing to consider is we're dealing with a law enforcement staffing shortage across the state, across the country. So already Phoenix PD is understaffed. Every department, I think, in the Valley is. So having that looming, whether it's a consent decree, whether it's mandated by the courts or otherwise, that also is a huge challenge for them moving forward with recruiting, retaining. That's a serious problem. And then it comes to, you have a city that does have higher crime and criminals who have been known to use force against civilians and officers at a higher rate than other cities, and you're going to potentially have a higher staffing shortage.
Yeah, there's a lot at stake here. Absolutely.
And one final point that I'll make is, it's also looking at, was the police department of 2016 and 17, were those issues already addressed? Because I know we talk a lot about, trying to poke holes in the DOJ report or find inaccuracies. But these were, some traumatic incidents for people that were involved in officer-involved shootings. And so, was it a one-off incident or is it a systemic problem? So those things, and trying not to, just paint those Phoenix police did, were those issues addressed, and is the Phoenix Police Department of today similar or different than it was in 2016 and 17?
Yeah, you have several dozen, maybe several hundred incidents that are questionable out of 8 to 10 million calls. And then some of these were just years and years ago, and the police department has made efforts to try to improve. Whether they've done it enough, we don't know. What's pretty sure is that we'll get a pretty clearer picture of this current status of the Phoenix Police Department. And I just want to close with this. We set out to do this sort of critical view of this report because I think people wanted to look at this report and have it tell them, answer the question, does the Phoenix Police Department violate people's constitutional rights? Are they doing unlawful policing? And they were looking at this report as an answer. And I think we found that I don't know that this report answers that question, because it has some problems. All right. Thank you for listening to our podcast. We're going to continue to report on this important issue, and you can find all of our original investigative reporting on TV, CBS 5 and 3 TV. Our website azfamily.com, and our mobile app. Thanks, everybody.